Hello, everyone. My name is Hillary Morales, and I am the chair of the Snohomish County Democrats. And it is my honor today to introduce our first speaker for this event, Alicia Crank. Let me just make sure that you guys can hear me all right, and we're good. Alicia Crank is the Chief Development Officer of At Work, a highly supportive and innovative conduit between people with disabilities and employers in the community. Prior to this role, she was a leader in major fundraising and partnership roles at the YWCA, Seattle Kings, Snohomish, City Year Seattle, and Washington Business Week. A Detroit native, Alicia has held several leadership positions in corporate banking, education, business, and the nonprofit sector in Silicon Valley. Having moved to Greater Seattle in 2014, she is now one of the only few women of color in corporate philanthropy. Alicia has served on several boards and commissions centered around equity and inclusion, and currently serves on the City of Edmonds Planning Board, as well as Vice Chair of the Snohomish County Paine-Field Airport Commission. It is my honor to invite Alicia to speak, and let's learn a little bit more. Alicia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. Hopefully you can all hear and see me. I want to make sure because I can't necessarily see. Perfect. All right, good morning. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. It has definitely been an interesting few weeks in doing what we need to do. And I don't know if we can advance the slide for me. Yes, so if you had asked me a year ago if I was going to be doing this topic, I would have had no idea that it would be so prevalent right now. And a few months ago when I was asked to speak on this topic, especially coming off of working at YWCA for the past 3 years and now into this new role on gender equity and looking at gender-based violence has really stood out for me. And so even in tweaking this message for this presentation today, I really decided that I wanted to really focus on how gender violence has come to the forefront, especially around Black Lives Matters. Next slide, please. So I think we all have a general sense of, what is gender-based violence. So I'll just leave the explanation here. But again, when you look at what's been happening for the past few weeks, few months, to be honest, I think between the pandemic and now everything with Black Lives Matters, is that it has honestly put me into a really uncomfortable position, because as much as I'm loving seeing what is happening because of what happened with George Floyd and so many others, Black women again are being lost in the shuffle. There's always we already have these campaigns around Breonna and Sandra Bland and other women who have, unfortunately died or come across violence where it doesn't create the same ripple as we're seeing with everything else. And so we're still waving our hands a bit and saying, what about Breonna? What about Breonna? What about, the other women that have been attacked, if not murdered? And we get lost. And so being able to talk about this today has really generated a lot of emotion for me. I'm sure a lot of emotion for many of you that are watching today. And so again, I just really want to talk more about how Black women specifically are being underrepresented as far as getting the support that they need around gender-based violence. Next, please. And so we're always inundated with statistics, but the reality is that the statistics on U.S. women and violence are staggering. And even if you look at these numbers right here, these numbers underscore the epidemic of sexual violence in the United States, which disproportionately, can't do big words this morning, which disproportionately impact women of color, immigrant women, LGBTQAI+, and disabled women. And I am personally learning so much more about how it is impacting disabled women just with my work at Work, Washington. But again, for African American women, sexual assault and violence are incredibly pervasive issues that routinely go unreported and underaddressed. And I will say, as someone who grew up in Detroit, and there were definitely good things about growing up there, but being able to also see some of the crime, especially those that involved Black women, I grew up around that and understood why it was sometimes unreported or not even talked about, because we were supposed to keep whatever happens in the home in the home. And we were supposed to be these strong women in our communities as well. So we were born to be, or bred to be told that we could take it. So unfortunately, the percentages that we're looking at even right now is that these percentages only account for the number of women who report it. We as a culture are not necessarily bred to report something like this. We're the ones that have to hold tight. And so now that kind of times and culture are changing, there is an uptick in the number of women of color and Black women that report these types of crimes and violence against them, but it's still pretty low. And we know that there are unique barriers that are faced by us on a political, economic, and cultural level. Cultural, I've already spoke to a little bit, economic, the same thing, but especially political. And as someone who kind of grew up around politics, have tried to dip her toe a few times into politics, again, the way that Black women are regarded in these areas really make it really tough to be able to feel like you can just be open and share because you're questioned more than others. Next slide, please. And so spending the last 3 years at YWCA has been really eye-opening for me. And again, it's one of the reasons why I ended up diving more into the statistics than I have in the past. But according to their National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, 54% of multiracial women, 46% of American Indian and Alaska Native women, and 43% of Black women have been victim of violence by an intimate partner. So you see, that's a pretty high number. It's not strangers, it's not one-offs. It's people that we have opened our lives and our hearts to be a part of who we are. And so to have that hurt be so close and tangential really does make a very strong emotional effect on us. Again, the same thing is true for 37% of Latinas, 36% of white women, and 20% of Asian or Pacific Islander women. So what do we know? We know that this means that the data shows that Black women experience the highest number of single female victim, single male perpetrator homicides. So now we're talking death. And in some states, Black women are the victims of all such homicides, according to data back in 2011. So yes, that's 9 years ago. I can only imagine what that number has upticked to today, and especially during having to stay at home. I think one of the things that really felt oxymoronic for a lot of us that work with sexual violence victims, domestic violence victims, is that the whole stay home, stay healthy didn't fit for a lot of the women that we know. Staying home was not a safe place to be. So to be in a situation where you're, consistently with your abuser and not really able to go anywhere else or to reach out really created a new level of danger that we were not prepared to address. And so we know that there was an uptick of number of phone calls coming into the domestic violence centers across the region and across the state. So what do we do? Especially when we know, again, Black women are 2.3 times more likely to be shot and killed. And when we have this very strong kind of gun violence debate that's happening across the country, and more people buying guns and hiding them and keeping them in their homes, my heart went out to every woman that I knew that was in that type of circumstance and just prayed that they could remain safe. Next slide, please. This was a tough thing to really kind of dive into, and I will encourage all of you at some point after this seminar today to really look at how Black women were represented or looked at during the slave period. Black women can often feel dehumanized, and that's because Black women and girls have historically been considered this way, and because of that, they don't come forward. When we look at what Mr. Holtzclaw talks about, what Mr. Holtzclaw did, who is, and I shouldn't even call him Mr. because he was a horrible person, but this police officer in 2015 specifically talked about the fact that he would target low-income Black women because he thought they were less likely to be believed. And one of the things that I alluded to earlier in this conversation is that when something like that happens to us, we are more questioned than others and not very likely to be believed. And because there is that history of that, having the courage to say that this happened to you or to report it, especially to report it against someone that is in a position of authority, like a police officer, throws everything off. Next slide, please. So the myth that Black women are aggressive combatants is difficult to trace. But again, it is more likely than not tied to the slave time. During slavery, Black women were not spared from physically demanding work. They were also subject to be working in the fields the same way as the men did. So there wasn't the women's way of doing something in the field versus the men's way. They were seen as equals in this case. And they were subjected to the same type of punishments that the male slaves received: whipping, branding, and mutilations. And also because of this, whites believed that Black women didn't have the same delicate constitutions that white women had, which was pretty oxymoronic in itself as well, because they weren't seen that same way, but yet they were also seen to be able to nurture their children and to raise their children, but somehow did not have the same maternal instincts and thoughts as the white women did. And you can really look at how this impacted Black women slaves when you look at the life of Sojourner Truth, and especially her speech in 1851, "Ain't I a Woman?" And if you have not taken an opportunity to actually read that, or a version of that, because I know there are several versions of that exist, you know, the fact that she talks about she had to bare her breast to silence those who questioned whether she was really a woman. Can you imagine that? And even looking at that today, to still feel like you have to somehow expose yourself in a way to make people think and understand that you are a woman, and that it shouldn't matter what your skin color is or where you came from to say that you're a woman. Next slide, please. There's a few things that can be done around this, but I think the other thing I really want to talk about when we talk about gender-based violence in women is police brutality. Now, there is a study that was done by the William and Mary Journal of Race, Gender, and Social Justice. This says Black women are routinely brutalized by police in ways that don't cause death. And of course, like I said, I know we know about Sandra and we know about Brianna, but it shouldn't always be those extremes to understand that Black women are subject to police violence. Police killings of Black people have received national attention. We're living through it right now. But again, Black women get lost in that shuffle. When you go back and look at the data that most departments keep on arrests, on complaints, and as someone who has sat on a Human Relations Commission in California and here, where we would get that data from the police departments, it rarely broke down how far it went into race, but it never really also talked about gender. And that's the one thing I hope that can change as reporting continues to mature, is that we look at how women within those race brackets are reporting, and reporting specifically what's happened to them. The Say Her Name project is attempting to bring women's stories to the forefront. But like I said, it's a struggle. So much so that we have to now kind of, what I've seen happen, and I'm sure all of you have seen this on social media too, that you almost have to take hostage other topics and memes that are going around social media so that you can squeeze in the Brianna message. How much more do we have to do to get people to pay attention? How much more do women have to go, what's the point, if no one is still going to take place from us? So let's talk about 3 things that you can do. Next slide, please. Become an informed ally. Now, I feel like that a lot of that is happening right now. There is a lot of reading. There's a lot of book clubs. There's a lot of people attending virtual webinars and events from some very notable folks to talk about what it means to be an ally. What I want to challenge you to do is to move beyond allyship and become an accomplice. And what I mean by that is that when you're in the ally space, there's a lot of listening and learning. But we don't want allies just to become scholars. We need action to go with that. So move from listening and learning to action and accountability. And that's a really not very comfortable thing to do for our white allies. It means that you're calling onto people to do what they're supposed to do. If you have an elected official who has run as progressive and about equal rights and equal opportunity and equity, if you don't see them doing the actual actions in this time and space, then it's up to you to call them out on it. Because if you don't, nothing changes. And there's so much change happening in the world right now. It's incredible. We know that we're not living in just another news cycle where you march for a couple of weeks and then it's over. Real change is happening. Allies are becoming accomplices. Businesses and governments are being called upon to make change, and they're making those changes. And there will be bumps along the way, but we have to continue moving this forward. That's how you become an informed accomplice. Next slide, please. You also need to center women in your advocacy. And I will tell you, this has been very challenging in a way that, again, it can be uncomfortable, not only for those that are part of this ally accomplishment, but for those of us like me that are in the fight every day. An example I want to give is something that recently happened here in Edmonds, where I live. And I will say I'm the resident Black woman here in Edmonds, and I have embraced that role because I can't do anything about it other than move away. And I'm not going to do that because I do actually love it here. And I think there's great people here. It's a beautiful place to be. But when you try to advocate for Black women or Black people in general, but you don't include them in the planning, there's a problem. And there was a recent rally and march that happened maybe a couple of weeks ago that was planned at the very last minute. The intent was great, but the Caucasian woman who put this together did not include any Black people that live here in Edmonds to be a part of the planning. And even though I was encouraged to see businesses downtown, closed temporarily to participate, there was no Black representation at that event. None of the speakers, none. And so you have to ask yourself, why? And what is the purpose of doing it if you're not going to include the people that you're trying to support? So there's a phrase that is cycling around. It has cycled around for years, and really a lot in the disability area, but can apply here as well, which is nothing about us without us. that has to be the mantra for any marginalized group that you are trying to support. And so there's another one that we're going to do and get planned the right way on July the 3rd here in Edmonds that will be multicultural, that will bring in the entire community. But most importantly, those that are helping and leading the planning are those that are a part of that community, which are Black women. So I am very proud to see that that happened. I'm proud to see that that turned into a teachable moment. But again, the reality is, if you don't talk about us without us, speak with us, not about us, speak to us, not at us. Those are the keys to centering Black women in your advocacy. Next, please. And lastly, support organizations that work on behalf of Black women. So again, you're not going to find a lot, if any, that are specific to that. But there are those out there that encompass it as part of what they do. National Organization of Women, Seattle chapter, and National is a great example of that. And obviously also YWCA. And I will say the Seattle Kingston-Homish chapter here does a lot of great race and social justice work. They just haven't necessarily executed it in a way that gets broad attention. So if you are looking to help broaden the good work that's being done by an organization, I would highly suggest reaching out to YWCA, Seattle Kingston-Homish, and figuring out how you can help them amplify the great work and messaging that they're doing. And even from a grassroots level, look at your different indivisible groups or ENACs or other groups like that. So there are opportunities, and there's opportunities to lead, and there's opportunities to be led. But allow yourself your opportunities to do that. Next slide, please. So my takeaway message here is that gender-based violence kills and disables many women aged 15 through 44, as much as all of these other things combined. That is a sobering number. So please know that even though gender-based violence isn't talked about a lot, and especially around Black women, that we have an opportunity to change that, and then to turn around the number of women that are affected. I would say for me, as someone who grew up around it, and it kept me from being around certain people growing up and in my adult life to prevent that happening to me, because I did unfortunately witness it, that when you don't feel like you have someone that you can talk to about it, that are not going to believe you, is so hard. So when these issues occur, don't feel like you have to be the person to figure out if it's true. I am a trust but verify type of person, believe me. But if you're already keeping the door closed to someone to be able to at least talk to you about it, then you're contributing to it. Thank you so much. I'm so glad I could help start the morning. My caffeine is finally kicking in now, and I will be happy to take any questions that you might have. So that'll be the next slide.
Yeah, while you were talking, we had a person submit a really great question. They said, yesterday, a friend of mine, white woman, got really piled on for asserting that sexism, misogyny, toxic masculinity was even more insidious than racism in the USA. How do we talk intelligently and compassionately about the intersectionality of misogyny and racism?
That is a good and heavy and multifaceted question. And what I would say is that the first thing that you have to do is really identify that friend. You really have to identify, where they're coming from. Is it really a general question? Are they coming from a place of an experience? Are they coming from a place of being attacked? And I say all that because when you try to have a pat answer to a lot of these things, it gets lost in the shuffle, because you have to be able to identify where the crux of that is coming from. And as far as talking about it intelligently, I think the key there is to talk about it in an honest space. If you're not someone that is very in tune to intersectionality and what that means and what that might mean across the board, be open and say, I'm not sure. Let's see how we can figure that out together. And I say that because something like that recently happened here in Edmonds, where one of my friends said, I know you have a lot going on, but do you want to co-host a virtual book club with me? Because there's a lot of us women in Edmonds that want to talk about this, that have questions. They're afraid to ask questions because they feel like they'll be either seen as rude or uncaring, or that it's just a stupid question. So, of course, we all got together and started reading So You Want to Talk About Race, the book that almost everybody's reading right now, which I think is great. And we've had some great conversations around that. And the chapter that we just talked about a couple of days ago was on intersectionality. So I hope that answered the question, but I think for the most part, there's no pat answer, but it's about first kind of looking at where the person's coming from and where is the origin that it derives from.
I think we have time for one more question. Can you tell us more about the Violence Against Women Act, and if our legislators currently support it, and what might specifically can we do to see it reenacted?
I was thinking about adding that to my deck, and I was like, I don't know if that's too heavy for a Saturday morning, but I'm glad that it came up anyway. So the answer is yes and no. The Domestic Violence Act, it is supported, but it's not supported in the way that it should be. As you know, we have a very Republican type group out there that it has not been supporting it. And I think we have some strong Democrats that do want to support it, are supporting it, but just don't have the numbers to push it through. So this is, again, where every vote matters, and it's not just about registering to vote, but to actually vote. We have to make sure that we're keeping this conversation in the forefront. And right now, there's so much noise around the pandemic and everything else that's going on with the protests and how they've morphed into other things, is that if we can have a dedicated group of people, and I know that we have some legislators that are watching right now, to really continue to hold that mantle and say that they support it and want to continue to push it through. But at the same time, we as their constituents have to have their back. It has to be a two-way street.